History always has a bizarrely funny way of repeating itself. Whether history, who knows, is just an actual entity that just likes to mess with humanity for its own personal amusement, we will never know. But what if I were to tell you that we've been here before? Because we have a cavalier Tory leader and a botched pandemic response. No, we're not talking about 2020 in this case. We're talking about 1957. So, Harold Macmillan was British Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963. A charming Tory with a patchy record. He's usually remembered for saying that during his government, Britons had never had it so good in their standard of living. What has been forgotten almost completely is that he said this in the middle of a pandemic. Macmillan made his claim on the 20th of July 1957 at a party rally in Bedford. Like Boris Johnson, he was a new premier with a preference for optimistic public statements. In 1957, the British economy was actually quite fragile, and Macmillan acknowledged this in his speech. But the idea that Tory rule kept Britain prosperous and safe was central to his premiership. As now, the party had already been in power for years and needed to present a Labour government as a terrible risk. The pandemic of a new strain of flu had started in China that previous winter, during the first half of 1957, and it steadily moved across Asia and then the rest of the world, killing hundreds of thousands of people, to the alarm of the world's media, including the British press. In June, the first case appeared in Britain, and yet that month and again in July, Macmillan's Health Secretary, Dennis Vosper, refused to make a public statement setting out what the threat of the flu actually posed, arguing that it was not spreading to the UK. By August, the virus was all over northwest England. Macmillan had finally begun to pay attention. He asked another health minister, John Vaughan, for his department's view on the situation. Vaughan Morgan replied, I think that's how you say it. He replied, the general assessment seems to be that eventually the flu will affect about 20% of the population. But he insisted that the virus was more a public relations than a medical problem. This is a heaven-sent topic for the press during the silly season. The government advised those with symptoms to stay at home, but otherwise took little national action as the flu spread right across the country during the autumn. Instead, leaving it to local medical officials to work out what to do. In some areas, schools were closed, but few sporting events or other mass gatherings were cancelled. In October, the peak of the outbreak in Britain, the Conservative Party conference went ahead as usual. Macmillan's speech didn't mention the pandemic. The outbreak continued into the winter and ultimately may have killed more than 30,000 Britons. Senior medical figures were horrified at Britain's performance. John Colbert MacDonald of the Public Health Laboratory Service wrote to Ian Watson of the Royal College of General Practitioners, saying, although we have had over 30 years to prepare for what should have been done in the event of an influenza pandemic since the previous one in 1918, we have all been rushing around trying to improvise solutions, but we can't only hope that in the end it may be possible to construct an adequate explanation of what happened. Many critics of Johnson over the coronavirus are hoping for a similar reckoning. The government is expecting one too, judging by its goalpost shifting rhetoric. This, as they say, is the Prime Minister's highly selective boast of this week that Britain had defied so many predictions about the impact of the virus. But Johnson's critics, the fate of Macmillan's government in the aftermath of the 1957 pandemic is not a reassuring precedent. During the later months of the crisis, not a point the government has reached yet, the Tory poll ratings did fall sharply. But the next time the general election came in 1959, the pandemic had receded. The Labour manifesto didn't even raise the government's handling of it. The Conservatives talked up their economic record instead and won easily, increasing their Commons majority to 100. In Britain, it remains disconcertingly easy, a sign of how lopsided our democracy is, for Tory governments responsible for disasters to change the subject. The right-wing bias of the press worse now than ever in the 1950s, as there are fewer left-wing leaning papers. It is the obvious villain. But more equally important is a reluctance from voters to face up to the sheer scale of what the Conservatives have sometimes gotten wrong. The 1957 flu catastrophe came the year after the disastrous British military intervention in Suez, also under the Conservatives and supported by Macmillan, which destroyed much of Britain's credibility as a world power. Similarly, the British Conservatives' failure closely follows the Tories' chaotic Brexit U-turns and hugely counterproductive austerity. Yet, in both eras, many voters have avoided coming to the unsettling conclusion that quite often their default ruling class simply isn't up to the job. It's more compelling to believe, as Johnson promised this week, that after all this latest calamity, the UK will emerge stronger than ever before. Our national myth often revolves around recovery from disaster. In this narrative, failures by the states, such as the Second World War setbacks that led to Dunkirk, just create opportunities for future greater success. As a politician preoccupied by history and not very good at governing, Johnson understands this well. His much admired optimism is really a form of cynicism. As he blunders through the present, he keeps the possibility of better times for Britain in the future floating perpetually in the distance like a mirage. Can the Tories' cynical optimism and visions of responsibility ever be effectively pointed out? If they can, Labour has a sharp enough leader. In 1957, Macmillan was mocked in Parliament as "never had it so good" speech by the Shadow Chancellor. With deft sarcasm, Harold Wilson called the speech remarkable. Wilson became Labour leader in 1963 as Macmillan's supposed economic miracle finally petered out, and won four of the next 5 elections. Keir Starmer might do well to get some old tapes of him out. So, could history indeed repeat itself? I think, to be honest, we're at a tipping point. And I think you have to ask the reckoning that is coming. And they know, the Conservatives know a reckoning is coming. Because even as some people, I did the video calling about that needs to be a public inquiry into what's going to happen. Even if, like, the Conservatives blocked one from happening, or they did their own parliamentary one behind closed doors, that's not the only option we have for a public inquiry, because the Lords too can call for a public inquiry. And as so has very often when this has been the case, the Lords have done an inquiry and their report has been far more damning and pointing out the failures of the current government than the one that the government did themselves. So, once again, just as we have continually looked to the House of Lords for general, actual, reasonable, sensible guidance on a lot of this stuff, it very much likes that we could be relying on the House of Lords once again for them to go forward with an actual proper public inquiry into just how and how badly wrong this coronavirus crisis really has been. Because we know all the reasons and we know who's been behind it all. It's just been the Tories. It's just, as has been described there, that there's this sunny upland, this mirage, and as long as we keep on heading towards it, we'll be fine. Doesn't matter if we don't get there, but as long as we get going in that direction, we'll be fine. We might lose a couple of people along the way, but as long as we keep on going, we'll be fine. And as I said there, that led to one of the longest periods of Labour rule this country has seen. So Keir Starmer has a lot of work to do. He's got a lot of work cut out for him. And I hope he does it. Like I say, I was supportive of Keir Starmer throughout his run. I hope he does a good job. I know many Momentum people aren't happy, but as I've said before to these people, look, Just because you don't have the leader you don't like, or doesn't mean that you can't still have an effect. You need to go to grassroots, get your councillors elected, campaign on their local level about, because Momentum has a full thing for what local councils can do. So push those things. Not only that, campaign for your MP to take up these things. If he doesn't support these things, eventually, he will step down at some point, or he might lose an election, and then there'll be another selection process. Get involved in that. Get your guy to the front. Keep on pushing the ideals that we believe in and that we want to be introduced into this country. You're gonna lose sometimes. It happens, but you have to keep on pushing these things.